Good morning.
Good morning, my lady. The first witness this morning is the Right Honourable Michael Gove MP.
I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Thanks.
Mr Gove, I'm sorry that we've had to call you back again. I do understand the difficulties it may cause, but it was necessary, I'm afraid.
Of course. Thank you.
You are Michael Gove.
Yes.
You've helpfully provided a number of statements to the inquiry, but two particularly to this module. The first, if we could have it up, please, is INQ 000371583. It's a statement dated the 14th of December 2023. Is that your statement?
It is.
You have signed the statement?
Yes.
Do the contents of that statement remain true and accurate as far as you're concerned?
Yes.
You've helpfully also provided us with an additional short statement, supplementary statement, with the reference INQ 000236648. This is a statement dated the 25th of January 2024. Is that also your statement?
It is.
And have you signed that statement?
Yes.
Do the contents of that statement remain true and accurate as far as you're concerned?
They do.
Thank you. You're a member of the UK Parliament for Surrey Heath?
Yes.
You were first elected to the UK Parliament in 2005, is that correct?
Yes.
You are currently the Secretary of State for Levelling Up Housing and Communities?
Yes.
You are also currently the Minister for Intergovernmental Relations?
Yes.
In your statement, you explain that you became significantly less involved in any aspect of the pandemic response after September 2021. Is that broadly correct?
Yes, it is.
In the period between January 2020 and September 2021, you were the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster.
Yes.
From mid-February 2020, you became Minister for the Cabinet Office.
Yes.
And after September 2021, you continued to have contact with the devolved administrations, including the Scottish Government, in your post as Minister for Intergovernmental Relations, but not in the context of the pandemic response. Is that correct?
That is correct.
As I say, you've given evidence already in connections with Module 1 and 2, both in statement form and in oral evidence. You're here today to give evidence in relation to the Scottish Government's decision-making and indeed the UK Government's decision-making insofar as it related to Scotland. I understand that you performed a role during the course of the pandemic as the Minister in the UK Government who acted as something of a conduit between the two governments. Would that be fair?
Yes, it would.
Over what period did you perform that role?
Essentially from the very beginning of the pandemic until the reshuffle in September of 2021 when I was appointed to my current post.
Would it be fair to say that in the exercise of that particular role, although you didn't hold principal ministerial responsibility for a number of areas, you're required to keep abreast of developments within both the UK Government and the Scottish Government with regard to the pandemic, so as to be able intelligently to discuss with the Scottish Government matters relating to the pandemic response across the UK?
Yes, to the best of my ability.
Thank you. I'd like to ask you some questions about the interaction between the devolution settlement and the pandemic response. The module has already heard significant evidence about the devolution settlement. Is it fair to say, as we've heard from other witnesses, that although the Scottish Government and the UK Government make decisions separately as regards matters within their respective devolved and reserved competencies, one might say that they share overall responsibility for policy decisions that impact Scotland?
Yes.
Reserved UK Government and devolved Scottish Government policies both impact outcomes in Scotland.
Yes.
And decisions, even decisions made by the UK Government with regard to its exclusive areas of competence in other parts of the United Kingdom, will have had an indirect effect on matters within Scotland as well.
Yes.
That's perhaps because, although these structures are man-made structures, the virus and its epidemiological flow did not respect those borders and structures.
Precisely so.
At all relevant times during the pandemic, the Scottish Government had devolved responsibility for public health, the health of Scotland more generally, the NHS, including hospitals, schools, and the social care sector. Is that your understanding?
Yes.
In your evidence to Module 2, you were asked some questions about this area, and you said on the 28th of November, it's at the transcript at page 116, which is available on the website, health is devolved and public health is devolved, but there is a distinction, I think, between two different types of public health intervention. On the one hand, there's the straightforward public health intervention, like keeping ourselves healthier, how much fruit do we eat, and so on. That's quite properly a matter for the devolved administrations. But when you are dealing with a pandemic, and a pandemic which is raging across one island, Great Britain, then I do think that there is a case for saying that there can and should be certain UK-wide powers exercised at the centre. I think that it is an open question to draw that distinction between two different types of public health interventions, because, again, one of the points that Michelle O'Neill makes very fairly is that the island of Ireland is a single epidemiological area. It was always regarded so in terms of animal health and a fortiori in terms of human health. So again, these are difficult issues to manage, and I wouldn't say that this was a view that I hold passionately, but I do think that the whole question about how you can ensure that the UK government, short of the Civil Contingencies Act, can say, look, we need to override some sort of independent decision-making you might make, I think that's worth considering. Was it fair to say that in advance of the pandemic, it was reasonably foreseeable that in a health emergency of the nature of the pandemic which the UK faced, it would require, given the underlying devolution settlement, a degree of cross-border cooperation?
Yes.
Would you say that it was necessary for there to be clarity as regards precisely what fell within the ambit of the Scottish Government's responsibility under the devolution settlement, and what it was that the UK Government would do insofar as impacted upon Scotland?
Yes, and I think that there is a case for greater clarity overall about devolved and reserved responsibilities. Would
it have been possible for greater clarity in that regard to have been achieved, given the fact that it was reasonably foreseeable in such a situation that cross-border cooperation would be necessary?
Yes, I think that, again, we dealt with a virus which was unprecedented in the speed with which it spread and also its lethality, but it is certainly the case that the devolution settlement evolves over time, and we can learn from how we responded to this virus to consider how the devolution settlement might be improved in the future. It is, of course, perfectly open to conclude that no constitutional settlement will ever be perfect, and that the current division of responsibilities is broadly right.
But clarity in this regard, in order to maximise the effectiveness of the response, is really key, isn't it?
Clarity is always helpful.
Is the distinction that you made in your evidence in Module 2 between public health matters which are clearly devolved, eating more fruit to refer to? We actually heard from Professor Devi Sridhar, public health expert, who talked about measures to fight obesity, smoking, alcohol consumption, all of which she had some involvement in. Is the distinction between that type of public health responsibility and some other type of public health responsibility a constitutional legal principle, as far as you're concerned?
No, I believe that it's a practical, operational question, and it relates, of course, to how we can protect the health of everyone within a particular geographic entity, in this case the island that is Great Britain. So a case has been made, and it's one to which I'm sympathetic, that when one's thinking of some biosecurity measures in respect of dealing with a virus, for example, questions over international travel or testing at the border, that there is a case for saying that that should be a UK-wide responsibility exercised by the UK government. And I submit to the inquiry that this is a legitimate and respectable point of view, but as I say, there can be arguments either way about the wisdom of going down that route, but it is certainly a case with which I have sympathy.
As far as the position of the UK government during the course of the pandemic is concerned, Was it your and the UK government's position that the Scottish Government was responsible for matters of public health, such as eating more fruit, but overall the UK Government retained responsibility for the management of the virus?
No, I think that it was clear from what happened during the course of the pandemic that the Scottish Government was responsible for deciding the non-pharmaceutical interventions that it believed were necessary in order to curtail the spread of the virus.
Did issues around the division of responsibility in this regard remain contentious or difficult throughout the pandemic, in particular as a result of your particular experience of dealing with the Scottish Government in your Four Nations meetings?
No, I think in my evidence I make the point that, of course, there were differences in approach, and of course we had different political parties operating across the United Kingdom, but the day-to-day management of the virus and the day-to-day responsibilities exercised by ministers in the devolved administrations and in the UK government was for the most part constructive.
My question was directed at trying to understand whether there was difficulty as regards the constitutional divide, rather than a subject we'll get onto, the personal interrelationships between people involved. What I was seeking to get at was, did it remain an issue as to what was the UK government's responsibility, what was the Scottish government's responsibility, which may, of course, have impacted upon the effectiveness of the overall response?
I wouldn't want to jump the gun, but I suspect that some might, in this module, want to make a point about the degree of fiscal devolution that the Scottish Government enjoys, and whether or not that should be greater, and whether or not that would enable the Scottish Government or a future Scottish Government to respond more effectively. I've outlined my views on that question, and I'm happy to return to them and indeed expand on them. But during the course of the pandemic, I did not see any real angst about the constitutional situation preventing effective decision-making and an effective response.
You mentioned in your earlier evidence the possibility, which I know you've discussed already with others in previous modules, that the way in which the pandemic management division, if you like, could have been approached was the use of the Civil Contingencies Act. You mentioned something short of the Civil Contingencies Act in your previous evidence. Would it not have been, if the UK government wished to exercise a wider control over matters of public health, would it not have been an option, a preferable option, for the UK government to have approached the division of responsibilities through that legal mechanism, about which we have again heard a little from previous witnesses?
Yes, I don't believe so. The Civil Contingencies Act is designed to deal with a catastrophe coming from a clear blue sky, a terrorist incident, or a hostile state actor unleashing the sort of havoc that requires an immediate emergency response. And also, it involves the curtailment of independent liberty to an extent that I think most people would find difficult to take, save in such a particular emergency. But I do think that it's worth looking at the operation of the Civil Contingencies Act and considering whether or not between that quite powerful intervention and the other interventions that we saw exercised during the course of the pandemic, might there be a need for a new mechanism or a new way of operating in order to deal with potential future threats to public health or safety?
Was this not literally a catastrophe that came from a clear blue sky?
No, because while it was undoubtedly a horrendous period in the life of our nations, and the loss of life and the pain suffered by many was momentous, the threshold for the Civil Contingencies Act, I think, is rightly very high, and it is the case that whatever successes or failures there were in the management of the pandemic, we could see the pandemic coming. It wasn't as though it were, as I say, like a terrorist attack, when you move from a moment of peace and serenity to their sudden dramatic loss of life that such an intervention might precipitate, or, as I say, a foreign state actor attacking. And the Civil Contingencies Act, by its very nature, leads to the centralisation of powers, the restrictions of liberties, that one would have to clear a very high threshold before initiating. So my own view is that the Civil Contingencies Act is too draconian an instrument in many cases for the sorts of challenges that we might face in the future.
The practical result, had that course been followed, I think you've already explained to us, but just to be clear, would have been that the UK government would have had greater power over the way in which the pandemic was managed across the nations of the United Kingdom. Is that broadly correct?
It would have done.
Yes, it would have done.
And it would have had greater power over and control over the actions of local government and individuals and civil society. It is, as I say, by draconian, I don't mean to say that it's never capable of being used, but it should only be used in very sparing and exceptional circumstances.
In the end, the way in which the pandemic was managed, we've heard some evidence from a political expert who talked about the civil contingencies route or the public health route being two options. The public health route was ultimately the one that was taken, if we can use that as a label. Is that fair?
Yes.
What happened was that legislation went through the UK Parliament, which became the Coronavirus Act 2020. In the schedules to that act, specific powers to do things like impose restrictions and ultimately lockdowns were accorded to the Scottish Government. Is that correct?
Yes.
And those powers became vested in the Scottish Government on the 26th of March 2020.
Yes.
Was it your understanding of the Scottish Government's position prior to that point that it was of the view that it had the constitutional power to impose restrictions and lockdowns in any event?
I believe that, I don't know what the Scottish Government thought, but I do believe that the Scottish Government, if the UK Government had chosen not to act, would undoubtedly have pressed us to grant them powers in order to be able to have the sorts of interventions, the non-pharmaceutical interventions, the lockdown powers that were subsequently exercised.
But your understanding, do I take from that, was that their position was that the Scottish Government thought that those powers would require to be granted to them, i.e. they did not have them?
Yes.
Thank you. So, as far as the legislative framework is concerned, the powers to manage matters of public health, to impose restrictions, lockdowns, or anything short of a lockdown, became clear, at least, on the 26th of March. Is that correct?
It certainly, they were further clarified. I think one of my experiences of devolution is that at different points, in issues arguably less important, the Scottish Government has pushed at the boundaries of the devolution settlement in order to establish that which it can do. It's inherent in the Scotland Act that those things which are reserved are listed and specified, but not those things which are devolved. And there is an argument put forward by the Scottish Government and others that anything that is not explicitly reserved is devolved, and therefore it is open to the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament to legislate in those areas. I won't stray further into that debate now, but it is certainly the case that some would have argued that even if the UK Government had been idle, that the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament would have been empowered to legislate in this area.
Despite, as I think you've accepted, the reasonable foreseeability of the need to have a cohesive, coordinated UK response in an emergency such as this, and the preferability, at least, of clarity around devolved and reserved competencies, this was not a matter which had been discussed or sorted out between the governments before the pandemic arrived, was it?
No, but there were regular occasions where the UK government and devolved administrations would work together to consider how to deal with civil contingencies, and there were also arrangements to discuss how they might deal with pandemics, particularly, as has been discussed elsewhere, the prospect of a flu pandemic, which was the principal operating assumption when it came to a public health emergency that the UK government was operating to.
If there were a concern on the part of the UK government that the Scottish Government tended to try to push the boundaries of devolution based on previous experience. It would have been perfectly open to the UK government to clarify the boundaries between each government's area of responsibility in advance as part of those preparedness exercises, would it not?
It would be possible. However, precisely given the tendency, particularly under the Scottish National Party, to see if the devolution boundaries can be pushed, one can't anticipate all of the areas where a Scottish government might choose to push those boundaries. Again, one of the emerging challenges that we all face across the world at the moment is artificial intelligence. At the time of the Scotland Act, AI was not a concept with which any of us were particularly familiar. There is an open question, probably not for this inquiry, so I shan't labour the point, as to whether or not artificial intelligence and the threat that it potentially poses, if not properly regulated, should be regulated at a UK level or at a Scotland or devolved administration level. Again, my argument would be that we should have that discussion now, but we can't always anticipate every future challenge that we may have to face, or indeed every future initiative that a duly elected Scottish Government might wish to press.
In contradistinction to the concept of artificial intelligence, Mr Gove, public health was a matter to which, as you've said, a considerable amount of attention was paid in advance of the pandemic. Therefore, it was entirely predictable that public health was a matter which required a degree of clarification as to the constitutional boundaries.
Yes, but I don't believe that in the response to the pandemic, that the constitutional questions, which are, of course, of great interest, actually impeded day-to-day our response. So, yes, in a perfect world, a greater degree of constitutional clarity on some of these questions would be preferable, but in the practical day-to-day operation of responding to the pandemic and the virus, I don't believe that these were material considerations.
You'll be pleased to hear, Mr Gove, I don't intend to take you through vast reams of WhatsApp messages, but I will take you to a few. If we could turn, please, to INQ 000163134, please. These are messages that I understand were provided to the inquiry by Mr Hancock, and they relate to discussions around a Four Nations approach to the governance of the Joint Biosecurity Centre in May 2020. Do you recall the discussions around that issue at that time?
I do.
The Joint Biosecurity Centre, I think, was formed as a new directorate within the Department of Health and Social Care in June 2020, eventually, to bring together data science, assessment and public health information and expertise to assist in the fight against the virus. Is that a fair description?
Totally.
Broadly, thank you. Can we just look at these, please? These messages say, if we start at the 30th of May, 2:14 p.m., it is said there that the owner of the cell phone, who I understand to be Mr Hancock, says, yes, it would be a UK body like MI5. Pandemic response is a reserved responsibility. It's the actions taken in response that are devolved. To which you respond, the sub, which I think should have gone to you, takes a different view based on legal advice. Do let me know if you haven't been sent it. And then the response thereafter from Mr Hancock is, I've now read the sub. I'm very unhappy with it. The JBC is designed as a UK institution that gathers and analyses data. It executes via many different agencies, local authorities, devolves, OGDs, etc. But there is no need for it to be run through a committee of the Four Nations. We wouldn't put English local authorities on the board. And then at 9:01, Mr Hancock says, the advice this sub is based on wrongly states that public health is devolved. That is not true. Parts of public health are devolved, fact fighting, local response, but public health emergencies are reserved matter. How can a sub on such an important matter miss such a critical part of the devolution settlement? Let's discuss in the morning. This clearly needs sorting out. So, broadly speaking, what's happening here is there's a discussion over the extent to which this Joint Biosecurity Centre would be a matter for UK government control. Is that right?
Yes.
And Mr Hancock has seen this as part of a more general attitude that he appears to have towards the way in which the public health response is being coordinated, saying the JBC falls within our remit, the UK government remit, because the public health response more generally, in terms of policy making, falls within our remit. Is that broadly correct?
That was Matt's view.
Yes.
Yes.
And what you are doing here is you're bringing to his attention a submission, it would appear to be a legal submission, a piece of advice, which tends to suggest that that interpretation of the devolution settlement may not be correct. Is that right?
Yes, and I think this goes very much to our earlier discussion. In the end, when the JBC was set up, as I think I mentioned in paragraph 74 of my evidence to this module, health ministers from all four administrations were on a ministerial board, and the devolved administrations were represented on the Joint Biosecurity Centre's steering board and technical board. So Matt, again, as the inquiry said, Matt, and I think this was a good thing, was a bullish, determined, energetic minister who wanted to ensure that there was rapid and effective action taken in dealing with the virus. My responsibility was to seek to make sure that we worked effectively with all of the devolved administrations. So I didn't seek to temper Matt's energy, but I did seek to ensure that we were operating on all fours with the devolved administrations. And in the end, we had an effective JBC, broadly in line with Matt's wishes, but one which also involved the devolved administrations and which benefited all.
Is this, Mr Gove, indicative of a wider attitude within the UK government, at least up to this point, that the UK government was really in control of policy across the United Kingdom with regard to the management of the pandemic?
No, I don't believe so, no. I think that at different times, naturally, there were some within the UK government that occasionally found it irksome that they might have to deal with devolved administrations taking a different view. But overall, the way in which the UK government worked was respectful towards and inclusive towards the devolved administration. So there may have been moments when individuals expressed, as energetic and determined individuals anxious to see action this day, they may have expressed irritation at the need to, take account of the devolved administrations, but they would also, at different times, have expressed perhaps irritation with how Public Health England or another part of the government machinery were operating. It's not, I think, a fundamental lack of respect. It's simply an outworking of the energetic impulse of well-meaning and public-spirited individuals.
It may not be a question of lack of respect, Mr Gove, but it is, I think, an indication as to Mr Hancock, who, let's be fair, was a central part of the UK government's response. Oh, yes. It's an indication of his understanding of the constitutional position. Despite legal advice to the contrary, he's of the view that public health is devolved and that public health is not devolved, and that statement was incorrect.
Yes, but I think I would balance that against the formidable array of evidence which shows Matt working collaboratively and effectively with health ministers across the United Kingdom. So Matt expresses a view. That view is born of his desire to press ahead energetically. But at the same time, this is one conversation, an important one. But set against that, there are the multiple, not just conversations, but agreements and shared actions that Matt, Jean Freeman, Hamza Yusuf, and others were responsible for. So a single conversation of this kind shouldn't be taken as evidence of the broader attitude that either Matt or the UK government took to effective and coordinated work.
It's your understanding and perspective, as you've said, that Mr Hancock and others within the UK government worked collaboratively and effectively with the Scottish government and indeed the other devolved administrations over this period. It is a consistent theme, however, of the Scottish government evidence that when attending or engaging in these apparently or these collaborative exercises, they felt very much that decisions had already been made by the UK government and that they were simply being invited to be told what those decisions were. Their position is, in effect, as Mr Hancock seems to be expressing here, that the UK government thought itself responsible for the public health response across the United Kingdom and that they were merely to be told what the decisions had already been, what they already were.
I don't think that the actual evidence would justify that. It was the case at different points that the Scottish Government and indeed other devolved administrations chose a different path. My view was, and I think to be fair, the view of most of those working in the devolved administrations was, that effective coordination and indeed a unified approach wherever possible was desirable. However, there were occasions where the Scottish Government chose a different communication strategy, a different set of lockdown metrics, different ratios for when people could meet outside and so on. And we not only respected that, but sought to work with the devolved administrations in that area. There were other areas, though, where it was undoubtedly the case that it was the strength of the UK government that was able to help everyone within the UK to respond better. We would not have been able to secure the effective vaccine rollout that we did without the UK government playing the role that it did in setting up the vaccine task force and so on. Of course, the Scottish Government and those working within the Scottish NHS played a heroic role in supporting that. I would take nothing away from them. But I think it is important to recognise that there were critical elements of the pandemic response where we benefited from having the broad shoulders of the UK Treasury and indeed the international negotiating and purchasing power of the UK government.
I think the timeline is potentially significant here, Mr Gove. But what I'm interested, you referenced the fact that there were times, either as regards public communications policy or the substantive strategy towards the management of the virus more generally, the Scottish Government took a different path. The timing of this is significant in that we've already heard evidence that it was around May 2020 where that divergence, which was not a phrase that the Scottish Government witnesses liked very much, but that divergence started really substantively to occur. What I'm interested in is why that divergence took place. Is it your position, Mr Gove, that there is no substance to the Scottish Government's criticism of the UK Government, in that in the period up to this point, they were excluded from decision-making such that they had to take their own path?
No, I don't think that's a fair characterisation. We strove always to make sure that the views of devolved administrations were heard, respected and fed into UK government decision-making. There was an intensity to the range of conversations at the beginning of the pandemic response that diminished a little as we moved into a period where it appeared that the virus was in retreat. And then, as the intensity of infection recurred, so the intensity of meetings recurred. But the UK was not unique in having conversations between the central government and devolved or regional or other governments in how to respond. And again, one of the points that I made in my evidence is that the federal chancellery in Germany sometimes had to deal with the fact that different Länder were pursuing different policies, and ensuring that there was an effective and unified response across the whole of Germany was a challenge. So yes, if you have devolution of any kind, and there were similar situations in France and Spain, then you will sometimes have divergent responses, because as administrations acquire more information about how to fight the virus, though more options become available, and it is possible for public-spirited individuals in different jurisdictions to argue for a slightly more energetic or a slightly more liberal response.
You mentioned something of the intensity of the initial discussions. We may return to that in a few moments, Mr Gove. You, as you have already given evidence in Module 2, were heavily engaged, principally engaged, I think, in what are known as the Four Nations meetings that took place. We know that these took place at different times and with a different level of regularity, and we know some of the matters that were discussed at these meetings. Was your mission in setting up these Four Nations meetings to try to do something about the fact that the existing systems for Scottish Government, UK Government collaboration had failed?
No, I don't think they had failed. Prior to the pandemic, my role as Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster had been to prepare for Britain's departure from the European Union and the potential eventuality of a no-deal Brexit. In that work, I had a series of meetings, conference calls, cabinet committee meetings with representatives, ministers and officials from the devolved administrations. And while, of course, the Scottish Government and the Welsh Government opposed the course that we were on, they recognised that the UK as a whole had made that decision. And we worked, I think, constructively during that period, even when it was a very politically contested goal, to make sure that we were ready for every eventuality at that time. And I think that, of course, it's open to the Scottish Government to feel that they were not as involved as they should have been at certain points, but I think the reality is that there was frank and open discussion of the delivery options available to us in that scenario, as there was subsequently in COVID.
I think it to be the case that although some meetings took place before this, this is in fact around the time when the regularity of those meetings started to pick up.
Yes.
Is that broadly correct? As I say, they weren't absolutely every week or anything like that, but no. One might say that from May onwards, that was a period in which your engagement in those meetings and your efforts in those meetings that was the period when you were ramping that up to an extent.
Yes, with respect specifically to COVID, there were a series of meetings that took place, whether through the forum of COBRA or otherwise, to agree the initial escalation towards the first lockdown. Then subsequent to that, ministerial implementation groups were set up in order to deal with the consequences of lockdown for public services, for the health service and so on. Then the ministerial implementation groups were wound down. That was partly because, as I say, the virus appeared to be in retreat, but partly also because these were quite cumbersome structures, and we then moved to a different rhythm of meetings in the late summer and autumn of 2020.
So in that narrative, just to make sure we're getting the timing correct, you talked about the initial period. The ministerial implementation groups lasted over what period, roughly?
I think from until, I suppose, the second half of the spring of into early summer of 2020. Right,
and then you omitted to tell us about the COBRA O and COBRA S committees, the COVID O and COVID S committees, that were ones that were, I think, part of the cabinet structure in the UK government.
Yes, right? they superseded the ministerial implementation groups. And again, one of the views that I had was that we needed to have a COVID task force at the centre of the UK government, and that we should move towards a system similar to that which we'd had in order to prepare for our departure from the European Union, the so-called EXO and XS split. But there were others who were more involved in the design and redesign of these structures in order to make sure that we had effective decision-making.
The COBRA meetings were attended by ministers from the Scottish Government?
Yes.
The MIGs, the Ministerial Implementation Groups, attended by ministers from the Scottish Government?
Yes.
The COVID O and COVID S groups were not?
COVID O did involve conversations with and attendance from Scottish ministers at certain points.
These were effectively the UK Cabinet subcommittees, is that not correct?
Yes, to which Scottish Government and other devolved administration ministers were in attendance, much as they had been with the XO meetings that occurred in the run-up to our departure from the European Union.
And after the timeline we've been talking about, the structural timeline, is it fair to say, as I suggested at the beginning, that at about the point we've reached in the narrative, that the meetings, the Four Nations meetings, which you were principally involved with, started to pick up pace as a means of communicating with the
Yes.
involved nations?
Exactly so. As well as the COVID-0 meetings, I would hold regular calls with representatives, normally the First Ministers, in order to be sure that issues which were not necessarily on the COVID-0 agenda, but which mattered to them, were ventilated and aired. It would normally be the case that the territorial offices, the Secretaries of State for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland would attend, and also officials, sometimes from the Treasury and sometimes from other departments.
Despite the fact that, as you've accepted, there was a need in a pandemic of this nature to maximise and achieve effective coordination between the nations of the United Kingdom and their administrations, do you accept, Mr Gove, that the structures which had existed before this point that we're talking about had failed, and that your attempts to rectify these failed decision-making structures through your meetings were really an attempt to make the best of a bad lot?
No. I wouldn't say they had failed, but I would say that the approach that we took was a process of iterative improvement. I think to say that the approach had failed is, and again, I don't want to police other people's responses, but for people who believe in Scotland's constitutional future as an independent nation, supporters of the SNP and other parties and organisations aligned behind independence, it is necessary to prove that the United Kingdom is a dysfunctional entity, and therefore the SNP and its supporters will often, when dealing with a situation that is not perfect, say, it's a failure. This is a proof that the UK, as a constitutional entity, is broken. As I say, the differences of opinion that occurred between the UK government and the Scottish government on day-to-day management of the pandemic were no greater than differences between the Federal Chancellery in Germany and the Länder in Germany, or between the Élysée in France and the respective regional administrators. But while I have great respect for the integrity and professionalism of Scottish Government ministers when it came to the handling of individual pandemic choices, we have to bear in mind that the political aim of the SNP is to destroy the United Kingdom. And from time to time, they will make political points to that end.
So if the inquiry were to hear evidence from ministers and officials within the Scottish Government to the effect that the cooperation and coordination structures before this point had failed, are you suggesting that that evidence would be politically motivated?
I think one would have to look at each individual piece of evidence, but it is undoubtedly the case that the inquiry has already heard evidence which shows that people within the Scottish Government were, at certain moments, looking at the political as well as the policy consequences of their choices.
Does your apparent assumption that the Scottish Government and its ministers' motivations are politically motivated, it would appear in everything they do, not rather indicate that there was a completely dysfunctional relationship between the two governments at the time?
No, and again, I hope that I said, and your question gives me the opportunity to make clear, I don't believe they're politically motivated in everything that they do. I think, as I hope I made clear earlier, that I have great respect for the professionalism with which many Scottish Government ministers conducted themselves, and I do believe that their overwhelming motivation was to protect the people of Scotland from a virus. However, there are and were occasions when the Scottish Government, as we can see, was thinking politically, and of course it is the case that the SNP has a political mission, which is to achieve Scotland's independence, i.e. to destroy the United Kingdom, and it would be naive not to be aware that highly skilled politicians, including those at the top of the Scottish Government, might well see what they perceive to be political advantage at certain points. But I think it's important to recognise that while that did occur at certain points, the day-to-day management of the pandemic preoccupied them as it preoccupied other ministers. So it's a matter of proportion and a matter of precision rather than a broad assault of the kind that the question invited me to agree with.
Is your evidence a thinly veiled assertion that the First Minister of Scotland managed the pandemic in Scotland in order to further the cause of independence?
No, I think it is the case, though, that evidence that we have heard shows that the First Minister and those working for her at particular times were thinking politically. And again, in my own earlier evidence, I made it clear that I had and have respect for the immensely hard work put in by many in the Scottish Government and their dedication to keeping people safe. But this inquiry has heard and seen direct evidence of the Scottish Government thinking politically. And again, as I say, it would be naive to assume that people who had dedicated their whole life to the cause of Scottish independence would not at certain points see the political component to some of the decisions and some of the points that were being made.
Did the UK government seek to do the same thing to promote its agenda to keep the UK together?
No, because I think the most important thing that we felt was that it was important to ensure that lives were saved across the United Kingdom. I mentioned earlier my own view that the existence of pan-UK structures helped to ensure that from the vaccine delivery through to the way in which eventually, after many difficulties, PPE was procured, helped. But I also think there's a difference, and the difference is this, that to believe in the integrity and to believe in the protection of a state, a political unit like the United Kingdom, is a responsibility that I have and all UK government ministers have. It's not a small p political thing. It is a matter of duty.
Ms Sturgeon is actually relatively complimentary of your role, Mr Gove, in the way in which you conducted yourself, but I think it fair to say that the statements that we've seen from Scottish Government ministers would suggest, as I've put to you, that although your efforts in the Four Nations calls were appreciated, they were seeking to make the best of a bad lot as it existed before that point.
Again, to be fair to the then First Minister and others, they will have expressed irritations sometimes, and those irritations, as I say, may well have come from a good faith position in disagreeing with the UK government over the precise measures that we were taking. And as I say, I respected very much the determination of each First Minister to do on a day-to-day basis their very best to protect their citizens. And if frustrations were expressed, I always sought to ensure that those frustrations were communicated to my colleagues in the UK government, and that wherever possible, we were able to work together and to accommodate a unified response.
Thank you. On the 23rd of July 2020, Boris Johnson, the then Prime Minister, visited Scotland. Nicola Sturgeon did not want to meet him, as I understand it, during the visit. Is that your understanding?
That is my understanding.
What intergovernmental discussion took place about the visit?
I don't recall any.
What was its purpose from the perspective of the UK government?
The Prime Minister of the United Kingdom should be able to visit any part of the United Kingdom at any time.
But what was its purpose at that particular time?
I believe that the Prime Minister visited Orkney, and I believe that he also was involved, I don't know if it was at that time, but certainly on a subsequent visit, he wished to thank those involved in the vaccine response.
Could we have a look, please, at INQ 000 274143? This is a Twitter post relating to the visit from the 23rd of July 2020 by the former First Minister of Scotland. She said, "I welcome the PM to Scotland today. One of the key arguments for independence is the ability of Scotland to take our own decisions, rather than having our future decided by politicians we didn't vote for, taking us down a path we haven't chosen." His presence highlights that. Were you aware of that tweet having been released on that day?
I'm sure I saw it, if not at the time that it was released subsequently, yes.
During the visit, the then Prime Minister spoke about the sheer might and merit of the Union. Do these iterations show that both the UK government and the Scottish government were playing politics at this key time in the pandemic response?
No, I don't. Well, firstly, I don't believe that's true of the UK government. I think it was a straightforward and important matter of fact that the UK government, whether or not it was led by a Conservative administration or by any other administration, by the nature of the unified strength, weight, presence that we had, was able, I mentioned the vaccine rollout, PPE, to provide protection for all of the UK's citizens. And I think it's important that everyone, whatever their views on the constitutional future of Scotland or any part of the United Kingdom, everyone who is a citizen of the United Kingdom is protected by the United Kingdom, and whether or not they voted for the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, he or she is their Prime Minister. Now, on this particular tweet, I recognise the political point that Nicola Sturgeon is making, but I don't object to that point being made. I think that it is perfectly legitimate for the leader of a political party with whose aims I profoundly disagree to pass comment in this way, of course. And I think I make the point in my evidence that from time to time, during the pandemic or at any point, SNP politicians would make the case for independence in broad terms, of course. Perfectly entitled to do that. I wouldn't take exception to this tweet.
You've mentioned the vaccine rollout on several occasions, although I haven't asked you any questions about it. Just for the sake of clarity, this was in July 2020. I think you suggested that this might be connected to the vaccine. I think this was maybe quite considerably before the time when the vaccine. I
think you're right, and my apologies. I think I remember that the Prime Minister visited Scotland, the then Prime Minister, Mr Johnson, visited Scotland on a number of occasions.
Yes.
One of those occasions, I'm pretty sure, subsequently, was to go to Livingston to thank those involved in the vaccine rollout. But I think on this occasion, the Prime Minister was visiting Orkney, and I think he spent some time with crab fishermen there. And I think one of the points that he wanted to better understand is, as we move towards a different approach towards fisheries outside the European Union, he wanted to get, as it were, on the ground feedback from those who were involved at the sharp end.
We understand it to be the case that on the 18th of March 2020, Cabinet Secretary for Constitution, Europe and External Affairs, Mr Michael Russell, wrote to you in your capacity as Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, setting out the Scottish Government's intention to pause campaigning for a second independence referendum in light of the threat.
Yes.
Is that broadly correct as to your understanding of the Scottish Government's position in this regard at that time?
Yes.
Did you consider this tweet to be consistent with that undertaking?
Yes, as I say, I wouldn't consider it inconsistent at all. Again, if it helps anybody, just to clarify, there will be moments when someone in Nicola Sturgeon's position is either asked or involved in a political conversation, and she will assert her faith in or support for independence. I don't think this is a fundamental distraction from the work that she or anyone else was undertaking on the pandemic. I think the reason why Mike Russell wrote that letter is to say that individuals who had been working within the Scottish Government on an independence strategy were going to be stood down and transferred to COVID functions. I think that was the right thing to do. Obviously not a decision for me, but I was grateful to him for communicating it. I think, and again, I wouldn't want to labour the point, the inquiry has had, however, about one or two other occasions where particular responses during the COVID pandemic were seen through a particular lens. So the distinction that I would draw is the commitment to upholding a set of political principles on which you were elected and which are your motivation, and then, on certain occasions, seeing an opportunity to advance those political principles and potentially taking decisions through that lens.
Was the purpose of the letter, as you understood it, not to communicate to you and indeed to the Scottish and wider UK public that although the SNP government in Scotland may have been elected on the basis of certain political principles and their principal policy of seeking independence, that those political considerations would be put to one side in the interests of the extreme public health emergency the nation was facing?
Yes. Well, again, I'm striving to be fair to the Scottish Government, with whom I have fundamental constitutional differences. I don't think that either Mike Russell or Nicola Sturgeon could excise from their thinking at any point their desire to see Scotland independent in due course. But what they did do was to shift the resources that were being devoted to pursuing that to COVID, and I think that was the right thing to do. However, there were other occasions where, as I say, trying to be fair but not naive, the Scottish Government looked at things through a particular political prism with respect to whether or not the case could be made in due course for independence, and that therefore there were certain occasions where divergence was being considered through a political lens.
Are there any particular occasions on which you think that was a problem?
Well, again, I think that the evidence that was discussed in this inquiry last week with the former First Minister's former Chief of Staff and Special Advisor would lead a fair-minded person to conclude that the words good old-fashioned rammy suggest that there was a search for political conflict rather than simply a divergence in policy conclusions.
Her explanation of the messages to which you're referring is that although she was asked questions about the possibility that may have a constitutional political significance, that what she was seeking to do at that time was to try to bring to public consciousness the difficulties that the Scottish Government was having with regard to accessing particularly furlough funding in the event that they wished, as appeared to have been their right under the 2020 Act, to pursue different restrictions from the UK. So her position was that that was not meant in a constitutional political sense, but in a more narrow political sense in seeking to try to achieve better outcomes on funding for the people of Scotland. Do you have anything to add to that, or is it your interpretation of that material that the constitutional political angle or argument that you've put forward is the correct interpretation, based on your experience from the time?
I will leave it to fair-minded observers to decide.
But do you have anything to add based on your experience of that period? I'm trying to understand whether that period is one of the periods that you're identifying as this being an issue. Your understanding of that period, in that period, did you have concerns in this regard?
I always wanted to put to one side, wherever possible, considerations of this kind. But I made the point earlier that one should not be overly naive. And as I say, it is possible, and I think this is the case, to have in the Scottish Government both a commitment from people who are public servants first to seeking to do their best for their fellow citizens, but also, given the cause to which they've devoted their lives, then the temptation at certain points to seek political advantage is clearly there. And I think that the language used, the desire to have a good old-fashioned rammy with the UK government, and some of the other language used, which I shan't repeat now, does lead me to believe that at that point there was a desire to pursue differentiation for the sake of advancing a particular political agenda. But of course, The First Minister, former First Minister, will be here later this week, and I want to take as balanced an approach as I can, paying tribute to her energy and hard work in seeking to do what was right, while at the same time acknowledging that the SNP as a political movement has a clear goal, and its members and its leadership have seldom missed an opportunity in other times to seek differentiation in order to advance that goal.
We've heard some evidence from materials within the Scottish Government operation that in trying to achieve good intergovernmental relations, certainly within the United Kingdom, there is often really no substitute for the heads of respective governments seeking to resolve differences, find solutions, and find ways through in the interest of the people. Would you agree with that?
I think it depends on circumstance, and I think it also is the case that the UK Prime Minister has a range of responsibilities, whoever he or she is, greater than that of the First Ministers of any devolved administration. I think it is a good thing for the UK Prime Minister to have as good relations as possible with First Ministers. That obviously depends on a variety of factors, but it will often be the case, particularly when you're dealing with an emergency like Covid-19, particularly when the Prime Minister will be leading a vaccine task force or operating 24/7 in a number of areas. It will often be the case that there will be a division of responsibilities, and in that division of responsibilities, he may well choose to appoint, as he did, another minister to deal with the conversations with devolved colleagues.
I'm not keeping a running score, but is there a reason why you keep mentioning the vaccines, although I'm not asking you about it?
Purely because that was one of the most important elements in our response to the pandemic, and also because I think that if one were to look at the whole history of our response to the pandemic, then I think it's important, my own view, I don't want to suggest that the inquiry should apportion its time in any particular way, but it's important to look both at how we responded in a way which enabled us to successfully exit lockdown and non-pharmaceutical interventions, as well as obviously looking at some of the decision-making, flawed and otherwise, that meant that perhaps we didn't lock down at the time that we should have done in the way that we should have done.
What was the UK government's exit strategy from the first lockdown, in particular with regard to the likely availability of a vaccine?
Well, we believed that it was important overall to seek to reduce infection to a manageable level, reduce R below 1, and to buy time, because we believed that it would be possible to secure a vaccine in due course, and that was the goal towards which so much effort was directed.
Can you give a little greater specification to the meanings of the word "in due course"?
Well, we wanted to make sure that we could get a vaccine as quickly as possible, and there were competing judgments about how quickly a vaccine could be secured, competing scientific judgments. But again, the hope was that if we secured that vaccine, then we would be able to put any thought of further lockdowns behind us.
In his Module 1 evidence, the former Deputy First Minister, Mr Swinney, stated that generally relationships, this is referring to the period at the beginning of the pandemic, which of course Module 1 was predominantly concerned with. Generally, relationships between the administrations were pretty poor by that point. Poor in the aftermath of Brexit, because obviously constituent parts of the United Kingdom, well, we were in Scotland, we were not happy with Brexit at all, or not happy with, and you obviously had to spend a lot of time on the no-deal Brexit, as the inquiry heard this morning from Nicola Sturgeon, but generally, relations were pretty poor. Would you agree with the assertion that generally, not just in relation to particular personalities, that relations between the governments at the outbreak of the pandemic were pretty poor?
No, I don't think that, for the reasons that the former Deputy First Minister quite rightly points out, I don't think that the relationships were as strong as they might have been because of the divergent political views on Brexit. However, I would say two things. The first is that day-to-day working on a variety of issues across all of the administrations was effective, and again, I appreciated the professionalism and commitment of Scottish Government ministers to dealing with what might have been the consequences of a no-deal Brexit, even as they devoutly wished to avoid that outcome. I also wished to avoid that outcome, but there was, of course, a difference in political analysis. The second thing, though, I would say is that personalities do matter in politics. And you can have people from different political traditions and different political parties whose style or whose outlook means that cooperation can be easier. And it is certainly my experience that there were people in the Scottish Government who were sometimes much more constructive than one or two others. And again, the inquiry can draw its own conclusions in due course about how important personalities are, but personalities do matter when you're dealing with tensions which inevitably involve some degree of politically divergent thinking.
Can you identify those who, within the Scottish Government, amongst senior ministers at least, were more constructive and those who were less constructive?
Well, I think the person who was undoubtedly one of the most constructive was Kate Forbes.
Can you explain why you would single her out?
Well, I fear I may be straying into political commentary here, but...
Well, please try and avoid that, Mr Gove. I've asked a question about
Yes,
the pandemic response.
of course. It was the case that in all conversations with Kate Forbes, she would eschew any political, what's the word? Not point scoring, but point making, and concentrate on the business in hand. There were some other ministers who would sometimes, even as we could come to a satisfactory conclusion, would sometimes preface their points with some political point making. So again, I would say that she stood out, but also I think that, to be fair, I know that my colleague Matthew Hancock found dealing with both Jean Freeman and Hamza Yousaf in their roles to be very straightforward as well.
Do I take it then the other senior ministers whom you've not mentioned fall into the other category?
No, I think it's fair to say that the Deputy First Minister, John Swinney, was also very professional.
Do I take it then that the First Minister falls into the category of other types of people?
The First Minister, again, was, as I characterised earlier, someone who was undoubtedly a focused and disciplined minister, but it would sometimes be the case, yes, that there would be a political complexion to some of the points she chose to make.
I think you mentioned a moment ago when we were discussing the letter that was sent by Mr Russell at the beginning, that you had an understanding that some of the officials who had been working on Brexit within the Scottish Government were repurposed to working on COVID. Was that correct? I should say, I think that's broadly consistent with our understanding as well.
Yes.
I just wanted to reflect on the particular comment made by Mr Swinney to the effect that Brexit and the very recent, at least temporarily, conclusion of the Brexit work at the end of January may have caused difficulties for those who had been involved in those difficult negotiations, if you like, between the Scottish Government and the UK Government at that time, in particular as regards the decision to repurpose those very people into another difficult intergovernmental situation, as you described. Is that your understanding of what broadly happened in terms of repurposing of staff? And did you feel that there were lingering issues relating to Brexit as a result?
No, I didn't detect any, no. So, again, obviously, it's for the Scottish Government to decide how civil servants working for the Scottish Government should be deployed. And I think it was the case, yes, that there were some who, as I understood it, had been working on Brexit preparations who were repurposed, and also some who'd been working on the case for independence, who were redeployed as well. And again, I don't know the numbers, but I think that is a welcome thing. But I didn't detect that the experience of having worked on no-deal Brexit led to any lack of commitment or professionalism or any additional anxiety within the operation of the Scottish Government towards the UK Government in its COVID response.
We discussed a moment ago, and I think we were in agreement, that there is a significant importance in our system when seeking to promote good intergovernmental relations, that the heads of the Scottish Government, UK Government, are able to interact in a way which is productive. Is that your position?
Ideally, yes.
You say in your statement at paragraph 61 that while Boris Johnson and Nicola Sturgeon were not soulmates, they were generally always able to secure pretty effective coordination of substantive policy respecting devolved and reserved competencies. Is the description that Boris Johnson and Nicola Sturgeon were not soulmates something of an understatement?
Understatement is sometimes the most effective means of communication.
Is it fair to say, and we've obviously, as you know, addressed this somewhat from the other perspective in some of the evidence we've heard already, that they simply did not get on at all?
No, I think on one level, they're very different figures. On another level, though, they're both skilled politicians, fired by passion, but they're also people who knew at a moment or moments of crisis the importance of respecting, insofar as possible, and working together insofar as possible, respecting each other's positions, working together. I'd say two things briefly. The first is that I think when the former First Minister's former Chief of Staff was giving evidence last week, she observed that the first time that Boris Johnson and Nicola Sturgeon met, which of course was preceding the pandemic, they had, in effect, a debate in Bute House. And, you know, there was a, as I've observed before, the former Prime Minister enjoys debate, can hold his own, and it's a sign of respect for someone else that he's engaging in that debate. So he undoubtedly had a degree of respect for the First Minister. However, it is also the case, as the inquiry has heard, my second point, that at times the First Minister expressed her disapproval of the way in which the Prime Minister was operating. And it was also the case that there were some people in our government and some people working for the Prime Minister who had a low or critical opinion of the First Minister. My view is that it was important to, in the interests of everyone, keep relations on as professional a footing as possible. And my observation is that in the formal settings where they interacted, that applied.
Was the former Prime Minister advised against engaging more with the Scottish Government or other devolved administrations more generally during the pandemic?
There were one or two people who did take that view, yes.
Could we look, please, at INQ 0000048313? This is an exchange which I think we've seen before in previous hearings. It is an exchange between Dominic Cummings and Mr Johnson regarding the Cabinet Office on the 12th of March. The passage at the top, if we could just see that briefly, the passage at the top, you may remember, Mr Gove, was one that was looked at. It reflected issues which Mr Cummings had with the way in which the Cabinet Office was responding. That's been looked at obviously in some detail in Module 2. I'm just trying to give this some context. So that was on the 12th of March, and then on the same day at the bottom there's an exchange, and again, as happened in Module 2, may I in advance apologise for the language. Mr Cummings said, you need to chair daily meetings in the Cabinet Room, not Cobra. On this from tomorrow, I'm going to tell the system this, not with the DAs on the fucking phone all the time either, so people can't tell you the truth. Why was Boris Johnson being advised that daily meetings at this vital time during the pandemic should be reorganised so that they took place in the cabinet room and away from COBRA, so that the devolved administrations who are represented at COBRA would not be on the line to allow advisers to speak more freely with him?
Well, I think Mr Cummings himself was asked about this exchange in a previous module,
yes,
and gave his account. The point he made then, which I think was a fair one, was that there needed to be a space in which the Prime Minister could interrogate data and recommendations, and different propositions could be put to him, and the Prime Minister could seek to test the strength of argument A or test the strength of argument B in confidence, before then coming to a conclusion about what he thought might be the right course. It's important to say two other things. That at the same time, as Dominic was making this case, there was also a regular tempo of meetings with the devolved administration ministers and representatives. And I think it's also the case, as we discussed in a previous module, that sometimes it's appropriate for the decision makers in any jurisdiction to have a safe space in which they can float different ideas without fear of those ideas being taken out of context and you to depict them in a particular way. Now, again, different people may conclude that that is or is not an effective form of decision-making, but it is certainly the case that whatever Dominic's views and intentions, and as I say, I think he fairly set them out in a previous module, it was not the case that we abandoned, nor do I really think that he was arguing that we should abandon having regular meetings with the devolved administrations.
Just to be clear, because I think there was a little difficulty picking up something of what you said there. You said it was important, I think, please tell me if I got this wrong, that it was important that decision makers would have a safe space in which they can float different ideas without fear of those ideas being taken out of context and to depict them in a particular way. Is that
yes.
Right? Sorry, it was just I think we missed a couple of the words there. Was there a concern that if these conversations took place with Nicola Sturgeon in the room, that she would seek to depict the Prime Minister, then Prime Minister, in a particular way?
Well, again, I can't speak to Dominic's particular concerns, but it's a function of government that the more people there are in a meeting, the greater the risk of a leak. When you have devolved administration colleagues on a call, obviously Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland represented, ministers from each jurisdiction, and officials, people from the territorial offices. I think, I have to be careful here, I think that actually Dominic's concerns, though of course, as I say, I don't want to speak for him directly, but I think they were slightly more to do with the Sinn Féin Deputy First Minister of Northern Ireland being on the call than the SNP First Minister of Scotland. But I think that, as I say, whatever was in his mind, it is a fair point to say that if you have a smaller and more intimate meeting, then you can allow the Prime Minister to interrogate certain propositions with the risk of leaking being proportionately lesser. But at the same time, you can have regular, focused and effective business-like meetings with others. As we noted, there was an unfortunate leak of the decision to go for a second lockdown in the autumn of 2020. And I think that the fact of that information leaking, though it had absolutely nothing to do with devolved administrations, I think reflects, with the benefit of hindsight, an understandable concern on the part of Prime Ministerial advisers to give a Prime Minister, or for that matter a First Minister, a certain space to kick around some very sensitive issues.
This message demonstrates an aspiration not to keep any particular devolved administration out, but all of them. Is that not correct?
Yes, but to be fair, and I think this is reflected in some other evidence, while there were sometimes bilateral calls, the nature of a COBRA meeting is that all of the devolved administrations would be represented. So it's either Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and the UK government, or just the UK government, as it were. So again, I'm sure if Dominic were asked to provide further evidence on that, I'm sure he would. But as I say, I think that his account of the previous module speaks for itself.
Putting aside the concerns, legitimate or otherwise, about leaks, is this exchange not consistent with the Scottish Government's position that the UK Government made decisions and merely communicated what those decisions were to the Scottish Government in subsequent meetings, rather than engaging them in the decision-making process?
No, because firstly, Dominic was one voice, an influential one, but one voice amongst many. Secondly, and I don't say this as a matter of criticism, but the Scottish Government did have discussions and deliberations, whether at cabinet level or otherwise, to which the UK Government wasn't privy, nor should we have been. So some of the decisions that the Scottish Government will have made about when to or how to exit lockdown will have been decisions that they will have made on a shared basis with shared information and an understanding of where other jurisdictions wished to go, but they will have made their own decisions. I respect that. Someone could say, well, suddenly the UK government is having to deal with the fact that the Scottish government have presented them with a fait accompli. You could depict it in that way, but I think that would be ungenerous. I think that one has to respect that there will be, at different levels of government, moments when within that level of government, a decision will be taken or decisions will be taken about what is properly that level of government's responsibility, but that at other points, before decisions are taken, views are garnered, conversations ensue, a thought, care and consideration is given.
We've talked about the concept of Scottish Government divergence from the UK's position about matters. Did this exchange represent a divergence on the part of the UK Government from the COBRA system, and in particular the devolved administration's involvement in it, which had been an important part of the pre-pandemic emergency planning system?
I do believe so, and I think, again, the point that was made by Dominic Cummings in his evidence is that, firstly, the COBRA system can describe a way of bringing different parts of government and indeed different governments together. So it can describe a process, but it also describes literally a room. In his evidence, Dominic made clear some of the deficiencies of COBRA as a location for decision-making, but the broader point of bringing in the devolved administrations and others to critical decisions, that principle was maintained throughout. I think it's fair to say that the frequency of those meetings at certain points, or the nature of those meetings, was not what certain First Ministers wanted. Mark Drakeford wrote to me in order to ask for an improved tempo. We agreed. So, again, I'm not claiming that our system was perfect, but the aim, the desire, always to ensure that we could coordinate effectively was there. And if I or the UK government fell short at any point in the eyes of First Ministers, we always sought to listen respectfully, make good, and create structures that worked.
If that's a convenient moment, lady, thank you.
Yes, of course. 11:40, please.
All right.